Well, like everyone, I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad that Pat and Rich have put this together. It's just really neat to have people from prevention science and positive youth development together in the same room, grappling with the same thorny issues. I don't know if, Ed, would you call them thorny issues or something? What we're going to do is I'm going to make a few comments, and then we have 3 people presenting, and then we will go to questions from you guys. Our charge from Pat and Rich was to look at lessons from prevention science and how we can apply them to positive youth development. So that's kind of our thinking here. There are 3 pieces, little mini pieces that I want to just mention. The first is, I think we're going to be bouncing back and forth in this session between experimental work and longitudinal work. And this was highlighted by several people in the last group, but I think what we'd like to do is be much more explicit about what body of research that we're talking about. Clearly, both have benefits and both have negatives. Both of them are trying to deal with selection, and both of them have selection issues. But I'm not sure we really want to talk about that. I think most people know about the selection bias, whether you're doing a longitudinal study or trying to control things so you have a really exogenous shock, which the economists will call our interventions. I don't know if they should be considered shocks or not, but so we're going to be talking about that, and like Rico said, I think we've put to bed cross-sectional studies, so I'm assuming people will not be talking about cross-sectional studies, because you can't do anything for selection in a cross-sectional study, nor can you do fixed effects. The second point is that one of our charges was to consider issues like system changes, because often the prevention trials do think about changing systems or relationships. And hopefully that's talked about primarily in terms of family, school, or community, and I hope we get more into that, if we have evidence of changing systems which change contexts, which make a difference for youth. And the third really has to do with bidirectional issues, which I'm hoping all of us think about. And I thought about this over the weekend in terms of my own work, but I think it's really important for all of us to consider. And I'm thinking here about my community work in Chicago with Tony Earls and Rob Sampson, and the fact that a neighborhood process that we have identified as collective efficacy, which some neighborhoods are high on and some are low on. And in fact, in terms of poor and near poor neighborhoods, some have high collective efficacy and some don't, so it's not perfectly conjoined with poverty of the neighborhood, right? There's some variation in poor and near poor neighborhoods. And you can argue that one thing we do our research on is seeing how things like collective efficacy or neighborhood violence may moderate the effects of after-school programs or extracurricular activities on kids' outcomes like juvenile delinquency and internalizing. You know, I pick kind of, not the simple ones, the mental health and achievement and engagement. Okay, so we've got a couple papers on this, which we love, showing that actually collective efficacy helps in terms of enhancing the efficacy of a particular, a group of after-school programs. But it can work the other way. A community program focusing on positive youth development could actually change the collective efficacy of a neighborhood. And there are 2 examples. One that's anecdotal, and it's killed me that I haven't been able to actually prove that this really happened. But I'll never, nobody will be able to. It really does look, if you map where the original Head Start centers were in Chicago, I'm sticking with Chicago because I know all this about Chicago neighborhoods, that the neighborhoods where Head Start went in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, happen to be the poor neighborhoods that seem to have the highest levels of collective efficacy now. Now, I can't prove it's causal, right? However, if you do the map and you look at when the different Head Starts came online through Chicago, it's a pretty interesting story. Okay, that's one example. Now, a real experimental story is Tony Earle's study in Tanzania. Do you guys know about this study? It was published in AJPH, and talking about Africa really, brings this home in a beautiful way. After doing the Chicago project, Tony's going, gosh, how do we increase collective efficacy in neighborhoods? Because every single person, whenever any of us give a talk, that's what they ask, right? Okay, guys, cool. This construct really seems to matter. But how are we going to develop it? How are we going to change the neighborhood? This is the systems change piece. Well, Tony went and randomly assigned neighborhoods in Moshi, Tanzania, to an intervention, and the intervention had to do with youth development and getting youth in those neighborhoods to work together, and in part they worked on plays to demonstrate to the neighborhood how malaria and HIV work and are transmitted. And plays were fabulous. My son and I went over, and my son participated with the youth in the neighborhoods, which was fabulous. The whole thing was fabulous. And I helped train some of the folks that were working with the youth in the neighborhoods in Tony's study. Okay, so what he did there was used a positive youth development program, and he randomized, and he changed behavior and collective efficacy in the communities that randomly were assigned the youth development programs. Pretty amazing. So the bidirectional piece of what we're all talking about, I just hope. It's really hard to do. Tony couldn't have done what he did in Moshi in the States, but the fact is it was a wonderful idea or example of how you could change collective efficacy through a positive youth development program. Everybody should know. Most people don't know that study, and I love it. So we have 4 issues that we're going to talk about, or we're going to try to do our questions around, and I think maybe I will just list those after our presentations. So we were hoping we could have a little bit of a frame for the discussion. It may not work, but we're going to try. But let's hear the presentations first, and then I'll give the 4 themes, and we'll see how it all works. And so our first speaker is Nick.
What I thought I'd do, Pat was up meeting with us, Catherine, Jason Downer, and we were talking last week, and I said, well, I could bring all my slides. Which ones should I bring? So I cut this short because I'm not going to talk about our 3rd generation trial, but I think it's fairly appropriate given the context of the discussion this morning. I'm trained as a child and family clinical psychologist, but I am a die-hard universal intervention person, and I've been doing this now for, I guess, 20 plus years. And every day I learn more and more how important Shep Kellum was in my development. And I know, obviously, Anne, I have not met Anne, I don't think, before, but knowing Shep and Anne and Peg go back, it's just amazing thinking about what he was always beating me over the head as a postdoc, as a psychologist, how poorly trained I was from a public health perspective and epidemiologic perspective. And here I'm always now beating up on psychologists saying the same kinds of things, but also just learn, practically speaking, when we're talking about, and I'm seeing this more and more, and NIMH is funding much more targeted, selective, indicated kinds of interventions, but without a universal in place, it just, Catherine and I are experiencing this working with John Lockman and Tom Nishan and others on work within our center that are more targeted interventions, but without a basis for those targeted interventions, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I just don't think you're really going to accomplish much. So anyway, again, I'm sure everybody knows what the IOM jargon has come up with. In terms of universal selected indicated interventions, what I'm going to be talking about is work that Shep began, and then I joined in probably about maybe 4 or 5 years later, and there's as listed up there as a whole host of other people who have been, working on this for many, many years. And most of the work we've done is at the universal level, but more recently, probably in the last 6 or 7 years, Shep has always talked about this nested approach. And so we've been trying to nest within the universals targeted interventions, a whole range of interventions. Right now, our center, which is currently funded by NIMH and NIDA, is focused on not only aggressive disruptive behavior, but also anxiety and depression kinds of things as well. For those of you who are not familiar with the work that's been going on at Hopkins under Shep's leadership for many, many years, and then got passed along to me probably about maybe 10, 12 years ago, is the focus has been on promotion largely of academic achievement, self-esteem, psychological well-being, at the same time trying to reduce attention problems, aggressive and shy behaviors. And this all work evolved out of Shep's and Peg's and the folks at University of Chicago's work in the Woodlawn area of Chicago. And Shep brought all that risk factor research, and we actually have a postdoc now who's working on analyzing some of the Woodlawn trial data. I wasn't really sure that they actually had a trial, but small, I guess, group, kind of almost like a psychotherapeutic kind of focus. And actually, our postdoc is suggesting that there are some nice intervention results. They haven't written them up yet, but hopefully. But anyway, essentially the focus has remained with us, at least at the universal level, is on moving achievement as well as reducing aggressive disruptive behaviors and promoting prosocial behavior and psychological well-being. And of course, the long-term objectives have been on the promotion side. And I do this in terms of my class that I lead on prevention of mental disorders and drug abuse. I started adding the promotion side because for the first school I walked into in Baltimore City to talk about this trial that we got funded to do back in the early 90s, I started talking about prevention of all the problem behaviors. And this was at Yorkwood Elementary in Northeast Baltimore, which is probably a middle income to probably lower end of the middle income black community. And this one guy just reamed me out for about 20, 25 minutes. Who was I coming in here talking about preventing problems? We didn't have any problems to prevent. So I started changing my slides. So we promote educational, social, and occupational success while preventing antisocial behavior, substance abuse, and depression. Okay, so there's actually been more than 2 generations, as I said. We'll just talk about the first 2 because they probably have the most, most results and have the longest longitudinal follow-up. So again, master learning, for those of you who are not familiar, developed at University of Chicago by Ben Bloom and colleagues. And essentially this was this whole focus, okay, you need to move achievement as well as, prosocial behavior, reduce aggressive and disruptive behavior and attention problems. And mastery learning was the main component of the instructional approach in the first generation trial. And then there's the good behavior game. So I'm sure Rico and others are fairly bored with the good behavior game, but we have some important and I think lasting results that we'll talk about. So with the good behavior game, it's essentially a very easy way to get good classroom management for even the I guess least experienced teachers. The classroom is just divided up into teams, and the teams don't compete against one another; they compete against a criterion for good behavior. And in the first generation trial, there are basically 19 schools, and the interventions were delivered over first and second grade. Schools were randomly assigned to intervention or control condition, and then within intervention schools, there was random assignment of teachers and students. How Shep pulled that off, I have no idea, but random assignment of teachers and students to classrooms. So you had randomization at the school level and within the school level. So like in the mastery learning schools, you had control first grade and second grade classrooms as well as intervention classrooms, the same thing in the good behavior game. Okay, so we don't need to talk about that. Essentially, I came in as more as a social learning cognitive person. and really a big adherent of Jerry Patterson, John Reed, Tom DeShawn's work. And so for School of Public Health, where there's not a big emphasis on theory, my big thing is trying to bring a little bit of theory and a little bit of conceptual framework to the interventions, particularly the good behavior game, and trying to understand those kinds of mechanisms. But we'll go past that. All right, so as I said, in the first generation, it was randomization at the school as well as at the classroom and teacher level. And I always try to make, oops, let me go back here, is the point of effectiveness versus efficacy trial. So Helena Kramer has this great paper about this whole issue of efficacy versus effectiveness. And she talks about that we should really think about it as a continuum. In our case, you have randomization, you have a well-defined protocol, you have monitoring of implementation fidelity. So in some sense, it sounds much more like an efficacy trial. But if you think about it in the continuum, you're talking about, well, it's not our teachers, it's the Baltimore City Public School System's teachers, so we're not their bosses. We can offer the training. Doesn't mean that they're going to take it up or that they're going to implement it. So we typically think about the work that we're doing is more of an effectiveness trial rather than an efficacy trial. Okay. So in terms of the first generation, we're actually just finishing, so I should update these slides. We're just finishing our age 30, 31 assessment, which was funded by NIDA. And in addition to collecting just about anything and everything, certainly there's a great emphasis. We have a team of economists who are working on the income data that we're getting from these guys now, their educational pursuits. We have one of our master's students as well as another economist working on looking at not only income but also educational attainment in terms of college, those kinds of things. And then we're also collecting DNA. All right, so, and this probably goes to this whole, I know there's another panel about methodological issues. So this is really not the greatest graphic, but it's an illustration of the effects of the good behavior game and the mechanism of the effects of the good behavior game. Basically, this is a growth mixture model. So most of you, I'm sure, have heard the term growth mixture, but it's really basically latent class, or actually a latent profile analysis, but the longitudinal indicators become the indicators that you would find in a cross-sectional model, a latent profile analysis. So basically what you're seeing up here are 3 trajectories that we've found, and this is for boys. And again, for those of you who know Baltimore, Baltimore City is about 65% African American. However, the Baltimore City Public Schools is about 95% African American. Most of the white folks wind up sending their kids to private schools. So what you have here is this largely African American males, and this is a study of their trajectories over grades 1 through 7. And basically, most of the males are in the low aggressive disruptive trajectory. Where the action is for the good behavior game is in that red trajectory, that red line up there. And basically, those are kids who are starting on this 6-point scale. Again, Anne would know about this. The TOCA was originally developed at University of Chicago. Then SHEP came along, and at that time in Chicago, it was a global assessment that teachers did. And then SHEP and one of his grad students, who's now a faculty member in the School of Public Health at Drexel, Lisa Ulmer, developed a multi-item scale out of this. Anyway, so teachers were completing this over grades 1 through 7. And basically, that top line shows where the intervention effect is. That basically the good behavior game altered the trajectory for those high aggressive boys. So as they started up around a scale of 4, which probably means that they were aggressive in terms of the teacher rating, aggressive disruptive most of the time during first grade. And as you can see, over time that it grows and then starts to decline. Big point here is that universal interventions typically are going to show intervention effects, but only for subgroups, because if you go with the public health notion that you have to have the risk factor to actually develop the disorder. Who's a universal intervention going to then help? It's probably people who are at least showing some modest to moderate levels of that risk factor. Those folks are already at the point of disorder. You're not going to help with the universal intervention. But there's a substantial number of young folks who are in this particular trial who are up in that trajectory, that upper trajectory, and the good behavior game seems to be benefiting, even though the intervention was only done over in first and second grade, that curve of that slope for aggressive disruptive behavior is decreasing all the way through 7th grade. Okay, here's some more data that we did. We've been collecting information from the Department of Corrections, along with antisocial personality disorder. So this basically shows, and again, we're talking about these trajectories. So class 1 is that high trajectory, right? So basically, you could see that 100% of the controls met criteria for antisocial personality disorder. It was a interview that was done over the phone, so it was our sort of like adaptation of a module that we got from Jay Turner. Whereas in the GBG, you had a rate of about 40%. So again, where the action is, you can see in class 2 and 3. So class 3 is the low class, and class 2 is the sort of like moderate class. Is most of the intervention effect is in that high trajectory class. And still, the GBG, there's still a lot of room for improvement there, because obviously still 40% of the young people met criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And I'm sure, well, I'm thinking that most of you know what that is, but basically you have to have a history of conduct disorder up until age 18, and then you would have to engage in serious violations of the law to meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Now, this is data from adult incarceration records as well as juvenile court records. And once again, the high trajectory, the control group, is about 50% rate of arrest or incarceration, whereas in the GBG group, and again, this is just in first and second grade, and again, this is for males, there's a reduction to 34% from 50%. Not a lot of other action going on in the other subgroups. This is also, actually this comes out of data that got published as a special issue in drug and alcohol dependence. And once again, you see an effect that varies somewhat, not as dramatic as in the growth mixture models, that for the GBG relative to controls for males, that there's a beneficial effect, and this is based on age 19, 20, 21 data, a follow-up that we did then, in terms of either drug abuse or dependence disorder. It's just sort of like it could be someone met criteria for either abuse or dependence across a whole range of disorders. This is specific to alcohol. Again, a benefit for the GBG. And then it's also in terms of smoking. You're seeing some benefit for the GBG in terms of reduction in terms of the lifetime number of cigarettes smoked. And for high school completion, so basically a fairly, again, a subgroup kind of response that if you looked at this from a main effect perspective, you would not find an effect for the good behavior game. But if you look at if you do an analysis in this case where you're looking at for a subgroup kind of response in terms of baseline ratings of teacher aggression, what you find is an effect for males in terms of high school graduation. Okay, so
Is it the bottom of the curve down? What age? It's hard to see.
So this is Hendricks Brown work. Yeah. So this is one of those. It's a GAM model or not. So basically, where there seems to be the particular period that is most, or I should say the particular area, or I guess the distribution of the curve, where it's the intervention effect is the greatest, is at the, you're going from about 3.5 up to about 6 on the aggression line.
So these are distributions of high school completion or not any growth?
No, I'm sorry. So these are the GAM models. So this is not a growth mixture model. This is basically showing where in the distribution of aggressive disruptive behavior in the fall of first grade the intervention effect is. So I should have clarified that. Yeah. Right. Okay. So basically, we've already talked a little bit about this, but essentially what you're seeing is some nice effects for the good behavior game, but largely for boys and at moderate risk in first grade, from the standpoint of being somewhere in the mid-range in terms of aggressive disruptive behavior. Okay, so I came along and
45 minutes.
4 or 5 minutes? Okay. All right, good. And I'll go through this quickly then. I came along as a postdoc, and I immediately got put into the role of putting together a family-based intervention to go along with the good behavior game and mastery learning. And then took us a little bit of a while to get funded, and then about 2 or 3 administrations for the school district, we were on hold for about 2.5 years. So we fielded this in the second generation in 1993. And what we were trying to do is, can we get greater, impact from the good behavior game by combining it with an academic instruction intervention, as well as adding a family component to this. Again, we see it as an effectiveness trial. In this case, it was a much smaller, because the NIMH originally gave it, we were going to get $1.7 million a year to do the trial, and then they capped us at $1 million. So we had to do a lot of retrenchment, particularly with the school system, because we already had 23 schools on board. And we had to cut schools, and people were very unhappy with us at that particular time. But anyway, so we wound up with 9 schools, 27 first grade classrooms. Again, this particular sample is even more African American than the original sample, so it's about 90% African American, and largely from the west side of Baltimore. And for those of you who know Baltimore, east and west have, meaning. There's distinctions between folks from the east and from the west. Once again, we had random assignment at the level of classroom and student, which I'm not sure if we could ever achieve today. And this family school partnership intervention, essentially, I spent about 2 years meeting with folks about what could we put together at the universal level that was not going to be so burdensome or so expensive that no school system would ever want to do it. I'm not quite sure really we achieved that goal, but we certainly got something together. And I probably had, maybe 6 or 7 contributors to this. But basically, the focus was on parent-school communication, a variety of tools that we use to facilitate that communication, and then providing a whole series of workshops for parents and teachers to work together, as well as with the school psychologists and social workers around discipline and support for academic achievement. And that, for lack of a better term, this classroom-centered intervention was a combination of the good behavior game and loosely an academic intervention or instructional improvement intervention that featured some elements of master learning, but a variety of other kinds of practices that were going, that the school system was interested in implementing at the time. Talk about this whole mutual kind of interest. It took us about 2 years to figure out what the school system wanted to do. They were no longer interested in mastery learning. They were interested in dialogic reading. They were interested in whole language approaches to math. And so that's what we worked with them on. And in this particular trial, we only did the intervention over the first grade year, largely because of funding problems. Okay, so we had pretest assessment. We're actually now just starting our age 25 assessment with these young folks. It's a sample that's a little bit less than 700. As I said, close to 90% African American, and about a little bit more than 2/3 of which were receiving subsidized school lunch, so basically free lunch. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details of this, but one of the things that we were trying to come up with, we've done a lot of work with these growth mixture models. But one of the things that we wanted to be able to do, or at least I wanted to be able to do, is say, oh, okay, so Shep has always talked about his life course social fields perspective and organizational perspective on development. We wanted to establish with the intervention trial whether or not you actually, if you move early success in terms of meeting the demands of the classroom teacher in terms of academic achievement as well as behavior, can you affect the trajectory of those young people in middle and high school? So this particular approach is a combination of latent transition analysis and growth mixture modeling. And it also overcame a methodological issue that we had, that the reviewers of my first R01 took 2 years before I could get it funded, and John Reed was an important part of getting that funded. Okay. Yeah, and I'm going to do it. I tell you I am going to do it. So anyway, we had a gap in our annual assessments. We had grades 1 through 3 data, then we were missing 4 and 5, so we wanted to come up with a strategy to get our 6 to 12 data. So this is what the model looks like, and this is a paper that I sent out just a few days ago. And essentially has the 2 growth mixture processes, grades 1 through 3, and then grades 6 through 12. These are all, in this case, these are all teacher-rated behaviors. And then we're looking at the intervention effects. And the basic question is if we do find an intervention effect, particularly for the outcomes, the grades 6 through 12, is it via any impact that we had on grades 1 through 3? So, okay, so basically, I'll just tell you what these results suggest. That, in fact, for our classroom-centered intervention, where we focused on improving teachers' instructional practices as well as their behavior management practices, particularly for males, we found not only a proximal effect for grades 1 through 3, but also grades 6 through 12. 6 through 12, it was more conduct problems that the teachers were rating, more serious kinds of problem. And that, in fact, for those boys, those males in the classroom-centered intervention condition in grades 1 through 3, or I should say in grade 1, and then their trajectory in terms of aggressive disruptive behavior in grades 1 through 3, the intervention had the effect of reducing the likelihood of those high trajectory boys, and in this case, we just got 2 trajectories. We got a low and then we got a high because the sample was much smaller than in our first trial. But basically, the intervention had an impact on reducing the likelihood of those high aggression boys in grades 1 through 3 going to the high conduct problem trajectory in grades 6 through 12. Some effect for girls, but it was proximal and for the classroom-centered intervention. And then basically, this is just illustrating this whole thing about the transition between high and low. We did find something for our family-centered intervention, but it was, again, for males, and it was actually in grades 6 through 12. We didn't see a significant effect early on. And my explanation for that is, and I think John Reed gave me this idea, or maybe it was one of his folks, Betsy Ramsey, who was working on a parenting intervention, is that, and we used to tell parents this, well, maybe your kid is not really a problem at this point, but we're going to give you a set of tools that you can put in your toolbox, and later on you may be able to use them. So this family-centered intervention, not a lot of proximal impact, but there seems to be some distal impact. Okay. So again, most of the results seem to be for those participants who are male and up, in the sort of like moderate level of risk early on. It does seem to suggest that if you, at least with these hybrid latent transition and growth mixture models, that we could demonstrate that if we can move that distal or that proximal process, we can also make a dent in the distal process. And that there, as if we go back to that first generation trial, and we'll have more data about this particular trial in terms of incarceration as well later down the road, but that we can actually make an impact in incarceration as well as antisocial personality disorder and increase high school graduation. As I mentioned before, we have an economist and one of our former master students who's now our data manager and analyst who's doing some nice data on the mastery learning intervention, because I always get that. Well, were there any effects? They're working on a paper now showing that there are effects for mastery learning, but it depends if you're in a school that was probably at the highest risk of, aggregate risk of kids dropping out of school in high school. And for kids who were at the lower end of early achievement when they entered first grade. Anyway, these are just some more effects for smoking that we're also finding in the second generation trial fairly consistently, largely for males and more, again, for males at the sort of like the low to moderate level, or I should say at the moderate level of risk. Okay, I'll just go through these real quick. All right, so anyway, bottom line is I think we have to do universal interventions, even though NIMH doesn't want to fund those anymore, and they don't want to fund work on things like conduct disorder, early aggressive disruptive behavior. They tend to want to focus more on the so-called serious mental disorders, but obviously these are a heck of a lot more prevalent than bipolar disorder. And even, and my wife is the point person for NIMH around suicide prevention, but even I have to say about suicide gets a lot of notice, but in fact, this is where I think all the action is, and that we need to focus there. If not, we're going to really miss the target. All right, I'll just stop there.
So for those that don't know me, I'm Velma Murry at Vanderbilt University, but was at the University of Georgia for 16 years, working in a prevention research center with Jeanne Brody. So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators at the University of Georgia that expanded to Iowa State, and Rick and Meg eventually moved to Dartmouth, and then for Virginia Mulgard at Iowa State and our participating families with funding. I'm going to begin my presentation talking about the context in which our kids grow up. And I say our kids, I do research with rural African American families who reside in southern regions of the United States. So that says a lot about the context in which these individuals find themselves raising their children. And the contributions then of social emotional development as a major indicator to focus on as we think about positive youth development. And then some broad conceptual and theoretical models that have been used to understand the development of African American children, or children in general, paying specific attention to some of those conceptual models that are unique to African American children, and then providing, if we had an ideal model that would be useful for understanding ways to move these children to positive development, what might that model look like, and then illustrate ways in which we tested a longitudinal study, the results of a longitudinal study on African American families by developing the Strong African American Families program. And someone mentioned earlier that when you have longitudinal data where you've identified malleable targets and then infuse them into a curriculum and give them back to the target population, it allows you to test the theory for which the curriculum is based on. And so that's what I'll share with you. So the one thing that, there's several things that's important in understanding the positive development of African American children. And when I received the invitation from Patrick and Rich, my first thought was, what might positive development look like for African American children? And so I thought specifically about these kids in the context of a majority culture. Then I began to think about what needs to be thought about if you're trying to move kids toward positive development, and then designing a preventive intervention program that is protective of their development to foster positive outcomes. So one thing we all know is that African American children are disproportionately affected by poverty. And we also know that, as Margaret said earlier, that there's an increased likelihood of them experiencing race-related experiences. And when I was listening to Nick talking about the involvement with the juvenile justice system, and sometimes it's for really, really small kinds of situations that white kids probably wouldn't have experienced the juvenile justice system in a much more readily pace, which explains a lot about what goes on in the life of these children and their families. So there's an increased risk of exposure to family and community violence because stress has a way of affecting not only the kids but the parents that bring it into the household, and so they're vulnerable to multiple negative life events. And all of these situations impedes children's development on multiple levels that we need to be mindful of. So my thought was that if we can hone in on those aspects of children's lives, like fostering social emotional development, that may serve as a major protective mechanism that will allow them then to develop well, because the self-awareness, and all the things that encompass social emotional development enhances youth ability and capacity to respond to and cope with both negative and adverse situations. And for African Americans, this is going to be critical to their ability to be able to thrive in our society. And so there are several models that might be informative as we think about this. The kids live in a much larger social context that eventually comes down to affecting them at an individual level, oftentimes occurring through what happens to their family and what happens inside their community. We know the importance of future orientation, as this whole time perspective theory is important in our understanding the need to have kids think about and be planful about a tomorrow. And I want to do a kind of a slight sidebar. I was at a SAMHSA meeting last week, and there was someone from the Native tribe shared with the SAMHSA group that he was having problems as a clinical psychologist to encourage these young people not to use drugs and substance, and that he was met with very little motivation to do that because they didn't see the need for being protective of their health because of the lack of future orientation. Yeah. So they've just reached the threshold where motivation is no longer there. And so when we're confronting those kinds of situations where, as Margaret mentioned earlier, the lack of being able to really benefit from the promise that people had been thought that they were living their lives for, then what do? So the other part of the theory that's important in the way that we think about children's development is develop a sense of self-efficacy, self-regulation, and emotional regulation. And then we begin to focus more specifically on aspects of what happens inside these children's communities and homes that may really matter in terms of fostering positive outcomes for them. And so we came up with this coin called no-nonsense parenting that really emerged from an ethnographic study by Virginia Young of rural African American families in the 1970s in Georgia. And she talked about the kind of parenting that African American parents engage in for the purpose of protecting their children so that they don't find themselves exposed to very negative circumstances in the future, for which I guess, Trayvon, I have to say this, parents really tried to do this, but it didn't forecast positive outcomes for them. But it's really to shield their children in a way that they are able to navigate in this world that may not necessarily receive them at face value. So these caregiving parenting practices, then, we find, are based on a pattern of life established in the African society that really is a modification of what occurred from enslavement. And so there's a sense of reliance on family and kinship system. There's the importance of being family-centered in their orientation. And there is this notion of the importance of facilitating what we call racial socialization, instilling racial pride in their children at the same time of helping them prepare for race-related coping strategies. And that's a parenting strategy that is unique to African American families. There may be much more acculturation, socialization that occur among other ethnic groups, but African American families engage in a form of parenting that really is race specific for their children. So the other model that I find useful to me in bridging all the other traditional frameworks is Marie Peters and Grace Massey, Mundane Extreme Environmental Stress Theory, which talks about ways in which we should really think about how race-related experiences infiltrate the family stress model, because it explains the way in which families manage their lives. And so the Mises model suggests that chronic exposure to racism is a life of that African Americans experience, is ubiquitous, is continuous, and it's a contextual part of their lives. That both subtle and overt forms of racism amplify other forms of stressful life events. And that's why these two researchers from years ago suggest you need to really think about the additive effect of race-related experiences in the context of negative life events or stressful life events, because they really do amplify the psychological functioning or malfunctioning of families. And so the children's development occurs in a context. It's impacted their emotions and mental well-being. It influences whether or not they're going to have access to the kinds of recreational activities that we say is very important in terms of prosocial development. It influences their ability and capacity to develop, sustaining, and carry relationships and of friendships as well as relationships with others. And it influences the psychological and prosocial development of these children. So the combined effect of economic strain and added stress related to racism, Arline Geronimus calls this as the weathering hypothesis, that eventually it wears and tears on individuals' mental state over time. It strains their ability to engage in healthy behaviors. It further increases risk vulnerability, and then it then in turn causes physical manifestation of diseases, which may explain a lot of what's going on in the life of these children and their families as they're moving them toward positive development. Okay. So then I began to think about, so if we take all of this into consideration, looking at things at the social, cultural, contextual level, and then the community where kids reside in, and what does or does not happen inside their families, that then fosters protective internal processes in kids that may then explain their development and adjustment over time, then what might this big model look like? And so I began to just list things, as you can see here, within the context of these frameworks. So you'd have to think about the economic situation, and I love Margaret bringing up this Brown versus the Board of Education today, because that needs to be thought about as we think about those kinds of societal contextual processes that may be affecting what's going on in the communities where these kids reside. And then the other thing that I thought about is that those social and contextual processes then explains what does or does not happen at the community level for these children. Whether or not they're going to be in an environment that embraces their sense of diversity, that increases the likelihood of them having access to various kinds of resources. And I think about many of the communities where our children reside. There's a public swimming pool, but the public swimming pool oftentimes is it's where the white kids go, and they get the sense, even though there's no sign there, that they don't really have the opportunity to go there. So living in a community where you feel the sense of acceptance and being a part of really affects who you're going to have in your relational resource mechanism that help you with, as Jenny said earlier, the sense of collective socialization and social ties. And then, and so at the community level, what those community protective factors do is what I surmise is that it creates a sense of collective efficacy among families, neighbors, teachers, and all of them that can really execute actions to help children achieve. It also helps for the family a sense of feeling a sense of belongingness for themselves as well as their children, and it creates a sense of investment in the future generation. So if you're in a community where people really feel the need to invest in youth, it's very apparent versus people who view families or churches being responsible for fostering the development of children in those communities. And so what these relational resources will do is allow kids to have access to other adults in the community that helps keep them on track. It provides social support systems not only for children but for their families, and then it also creates an opportunity for natural mentors or these non-familiar adults who can invest in these children, and other kinds of opportunities for those resources are listed in terms of church, school. So then those particular contextual and at the community contextual and relational processes then eventually filters inside the family and affects what happens inside the family, including affecting their beliefs and expectations about academics, affecting what the kind of environment that they can develop for their families, affects their sense of prosocial efficacy of the things that we say are important for kids to develop prosocial skills. If you don't have the resources or the community investment in that, it makes families then feel less efficacious in their ability to really make a difference in the life of their children. So then we talk about the importance of social capital. How do you begin to advocate or teach families how to advocate for themselves to garner those resources at the church, school, and community level? And so at the family protective level, the things that we think about are their aspirations for their children. And this is really the area where my research as well as the intervention focuses on. How do you empower families to begin to think of ways that they themselves can create a context for the positive development of their children? And so one of the things that they can do is help them believe in the future, give them a sense of promise in that, articulate what their expectations and norms are that guide their children's behavior, that then relates to the kind of prosocial development that they have. Giving parents skills to know how to become active and involved in the life of their child, and then creating a sense of social capital and involving other institutions in the well-being of their children. And then that then will lead to social emotional development in children. And you can see that I have links between the community resource level and the family parenting level to foster those indicators that I think about in terms of positive outcomes for children. A sense of identity, a sense of self-regulation as well as emotional regulation, feeling a sense of competence, self-competence, prosocial peers, and involvement, I think someone said earlier, in spirituality or religious involvement, and then future orientation. That then will explain what I surmise is adjustment and behavior in children. So I'm going to then share with you a case study that we developed, and these are some of our middle schoolers in Georgia. And it's the Strong African American Families. And the program is based on over a decade of research. In fact, 12 years of research that my colleagues and I had conducted with rural African American families. And our questions focused on what is it about these families and their communities that foster competence and psychological adjustment in their children. So we started our conceptual framework of our longitudinal work trying to track the trajectory of positive outcomes and positive development in these children. And then we took that information and we identified those targets that kept emerging in our models that appeared to be predicting positive outcomes as rated by teachers in these children's development. We took those protective factors, we designed a program. And then we began to test the efficacy of this program, not only whether or not the program was efficacious in changing those things that we had targeted in the intervention, but we made sure that our measures were culturally sensitive to the things that we were proposing to change. So the intervention is based on this heuristic model, and it primarily the outcome we were trying to reduce was HIV/AIDS, early sexual onset, the initiation use of alcohol, drugs, and then avoiding the affiliation with risk-engaging peers. And we exposed them to the program when they were middle schoolers. We wanted to see some immediate changes in their decreased vulnerability to HIV risk behaviors. And then we proposed that long term, by preventing these behaviors early onset, it would then foster less likelihood of actual HIV related behaviors as they got older. And you can see what we targeted were these things that we proposed mattered because our longitudinal model showed us that those were the things that mattered. What we call regulated communicative parenting. And these are things that our parents could do despite living in communities where they may or may not have the resources to do these things. This is what they were empowered to do. And by inoculating them with the skill development through the curriculum that allowed them to enhance their ability to do these things, it then fostered these intra-youth protective processes that our research showed were extremely important in predicting psychological adjustment and competence among our children. So the goal of the SAAF program then was to enhance and strengthen family processes that protect youth from engaging in high-risk behaviors. Now we say high risk specifically as it relates to alcohol and drugs, but we also wanted to increase school bonding. We wanted to lower conduct problems because those were the things that would get in the way of them being able to really develop well as they moved along into adolescence. 5 minutes, okay. So it was a 7-week meeting held in community centers, so we were not in the school, led by trained lay people in the communities, randomized controlled trial of 700 families. The sessions that the people were involved in, you can see once again, they were sessions that focused on enhancing parenting, enhancing communication, helping kids understand the importance of abiding by rules, having, and those prosocial resistance efficacy, and then components that help them understand how to engage in adaptive behavioral strategies around race-related experiences. So exposure to SAAF has had positive outcomes thus far. By the way, the kids are now 20 and 21 years of age. We're still following them over time, this longitudinal design. But we were able to enhance those targeted parenting practices that were emphasized in the curriculum. It fostered self-control in kids. And then you can see that it also fostered those less favorable images of risk-engaging age mates so that they would begin to become friends with prosocial peers. It increased the likelihood that they were going to internalize their norms and expectations that their parents had for them regarding prosocial behavior. And then we also have shown fewer incidences of internalizing, externalizing behaviors in children, including depression, anxiety, and other kinds of externalizing behaviors. And I'm finished. Thank you. Thank you.
So while the baton is coming my way, I want to thank Patrick and Rich for including me in this discussion. And a couple people have made jokes about age and youth, and I just want to admit to being sort of a novice in this area, and I appreciate really being invited to be around the table. I'm a junior scholar, but also somebody who is relatively new to work on thinking about sort of prevention and intervention. I come from a developmental psychology background with an interest in identity, and actually just not too long ago was in a master's program where I still can't call her Margaret. Dr. Spencer was the head of that program. So it's nice to sort of be in the midst of all of this expertise. And I think my status as a junior scholar in some ways informs the direction that I decided to take my presentation. Something that Rich Lerner said at the end of the last panel session is quite a relevant issue to me, as I'm sure many of you remember. And that's an issue around sort of funding and how do we, as junior scholars in particular, sort of meet the needs of funders So what I'm going to talk about today, I think, is an issue that when we think about prevention versus promotion, in some ways maps onto perspectives that funders might have versus perspectives that researchers and program providers might have, and potential conflicts between the two. Before I go on to my next slide, I want to give a little bit of another disclaimer. The next slide is going to talk about mentoring. So it seems to be a topic that people really wanted to engage in. I'm not going to talk about mentoring specifically in detail, but the context of the program and the evaluation that I will be sharing, it happens to be a mentoring program. And I think, I'll go ahead and pull it up. As I was sort of looking at some of these recent meta-analyses, I was interested in this idea that perhaps there are some perspectives that map onto this idea of prevention versus promotion. In Pat Tolan's meta-analysis, which focused on mentoring in the context of juvenile delinquency, just pulling from some of the summary of what they found, some of the buzzwords in here to me were pretty interesting. So mentoring as an intervention to prevent, divert, and remediate youth engaged in risk behavior, and so on and so forth. And then on the other side, we have the recent meta-analysis by David Dubois and Jeanne Rhodes and others that looks at mentoring as an approach for fostering healthy development. And this sort of speaking to caring and meaningful relationships. I imagine probably Jeanne will talk more about this when when her panel is speaking tomorrow. But so here, in some ways, it's kind of interesting because these two perspectives are talking about a similar domain of mentoring, but one is really grounded in a prevention perspective and the other is grounded in more of a promotion perspective. What's important is that the conclusions from these two meta-analyses in some ways do converge onto similar findings. So there's evidence that mentoring can be both preventive and promotive in terms of thinking about youth development. So we can sort of understand these as not mutually exclusive perspectives. They also both found that there tends to be increased effectiveness for youth who've got some pre-existing risk. So thinking about, something that Nick spoke to in his presentation, thinking about youth who are in different, say, clusters or trajectories, we might see different outcomes depending on where they begin. And several people have alluded to this idea that when ecological risk is present, and then there's also individual risk present, trajectories of development could potentially look different as well. And each of the meta-analyses also spoke to this issue that we need increased attention to program and evaluation design. So in the context of mentoring, thinking about specific theories of change, what's going on in terms of underlying processes, we need to pay more attention to that. So that's kind of just a little bit of a backdrop to the specific example I want to talk about. Again, going to this idea that potentially there are different priorities that funders have and programmers have that map onto this idea of should we be thinking about prevention or promotion, and how do we kind of marry these perspectives. So as an example, there's a particular funding agency that myself and colleagues, including some around the table, have sought funding from to look at a mentoring program for middle school girls. The request for proposals specifically focused on adolescent girls and the idea that perhaps there is some increasing involvement of girls in delinquent behavior, so aggressive behavior and other risk-taking behavior, and increasing representation of girls in the juvenile justice system. And of course, there's lots of debate over reasons for that. Are we paying more attention to girls, or are girls really engaging in more sort of risky behavior? But the framework really, if you sort of, as reading through this request for proposals, the kind of sort of push that it took was thinking about girls as having problems that we need to prevent or treat. So there was really this prevention focus in terms of what the funders were interested in kind of exploring. So they called for, because of this increased risk for delinquency among girls, there was a call for additional research needed on programs that could potentially prevent increased risk or prevent trajectories of delinquency for girls. So that's where I began with colleagues who I work collaboratively on this project with. And it created this sort of interesting challenge because the mentoring program that I'll speak about is specific to middle school girls. And the thinking of the people who've designed the program is that in some ways it is designed to prevent delinquency and foster positive outcomes. But in other ways, really the grounding, the sort of theoretical framework comes from more of a promotion perspective. So the funder is saying we want to identify programs and sort of understand programs that can help us figure out how to support the developmental trajectories of girls. So the response from the programmers and the researchers involved was that in thinking about how to respond to this request for applications was that we would frame the mentoring intervention from more of a problem-based perspective and emphasize risk among girls. So it's like this idea that we're moving from we're starting from a prevention as opposed to a promotion perspective, identifying a problem, identifying a target population, and so on and so forth. So there is some evidence in which this makes perfect sense. We know, for example, that relational issues can potentially create risk for girls in terms of delinquency and delinquent behaviors. So we know that relational issues are often connected to other forms of delinquent behavior, whether that be physical aggression, substance use, and things along those lines. At the same time, there's also evidence that suggests that relational issues can be protective factors in the domain of girls' delinquency. So the sort of summary is that mentoring may be particularly critical for girls in early adolescence. So the programmers and the researchers thinking about crafting a response to this, to the funders, focused in on this idea that early adolescence could be a critical period for effective mentoring, particularly among early adolescent girls. So we've got what the funder is interested. We've got the response as sort of crafted by the research team and the programmers, but there's still a little bit of a challenge. And this is something that I think we are kind of in the midst of, and there's been research going on in this program for a number of years. But for this particular set of findings that we're sort of interested in looking at, the intervention curriculum focuses on competence promotion. So it's grounded in self-determination theory. So we're talking about emphasizing competence and connection and autonomy among girls. The other piece of the challenge is that the sample of girls who are involved in the program is somewhat heterogeneous. I'll talk a little bit about the program design in just a few minutes, but in thinking about kind of, again, balancing this idea of how do we design a prevention program which has some sort of, I think there's a specific process involved, as we saw in Rico's presentation earlier, particularly when the content of the program is about promoting competence as opposed to the sort of main thrust of the program being to prevent risk. Will this create any or what sort of challenges does this create in terms of thinking about measuring and identifying the appropriate outcomes, particularly given the funder's interest in prevention? So in this example, there's the funders have this underlying question about can we treat delinquency in girls, and will a competence-based program work effectively? And again, I think this kind of speaks to this debate about prevention science and positive youth development perspectives. So although I think as researchers, we've already started talking about the fact that these two perspectives are starting to converge or have converged over the past number of years, I'm not sure that funders and policymakers are on board with that idea. So I don't know that they necessarily care as much as we might about the sort of, in some ways, is it an issue of semantics? I don't think it is, but I don't know that they've bought into the competence promotion perspective as much. And so for people looking for research support and for programs looking to partner with researchers, there's still this very real challenge of kind of meeting the needs of funders and policymakers, and really even kind of the popular sort of media in general. So we still tend to think about youth as being having potential to get in trouble or create trouble. In the context of delinquency prevention in girls, this sort of rising story that girls are getting in trouble more and more. We see it represented in things like YouTube videos where we see girls getting in fights. So I don't know that the science and the sort of, again, policy and funding side of things have really met. So it's this challenge that we're kind of facing in doing research on this particular mentoring program. All right, so now a couple of slides just about the context of this program to give you a little bit of insight onto how it's designed. It's called the Young Women Leaders Program, and it is actually local to this area, so I'm here at the Curry School at UVA. It uses a combination of one-on-one and group-based mentoring. So there's an idea that the one-on-one sort of traditional mentoring paradigm might be optimal for thinking about, as we heard earlier, developing relationships as the outcome. And at the same time, the group-based side of things might be optimal for promoting positive peer interactions, which again, the idea is that those could also help with thinking about decreasing risk for delinquent behavior and aggression and things along those lines. It uses college women as mentors, and the next two bullet points, so the careful screening of mentors and ongoing mentor training and support, kind of speak to some of the best practices that have been identified in the mentoring literature. So what do we need programs to do in order to be effective? There's a lot more of those. I didn't want to spend too much time going into the nitty-gritty of the program, but the program really has tried to think about learning from existing research on mentoring in terms of design and support. And that happens a lot, particularly with mentor training. It happens throughout the school year. So the mentoring relationships last over the course of an academic year. Girls are involved in 7th grade and have the option of continuing on for a second year as well. On the evaluation side, started even before I actually joined the Curry faculty. So I'm going to point out Nancy Deutsch, who's been involved in a lot of this research prior to me coming on board. So there's been an approach that's taken both experimental and quasi-experimental designs. So some randomized evaluations of girls. There's also been a mixed methods approach. So Nancy really heads up the qualitative side of things, supported in part by the WT Grant Foundation. So in addition to traditional pre and post program survey data collection, there's also a rich set of data that is based on observations of girls in the mentoring groups. It's based on interviews with the mentors and the mentees. So there's a lot of research to draw from. And it's been, there's an approach that uses multiple informants as well. So in past iterations of research, that's included the mentors and the mentees as well as school counselors. In our current evaluation, we also collect data from parents as well as teachers. So from a research perspective, there's a lot going on in terms of support of this program. I have mentioned already that the theoretical basis of the program is self-determination theory. So the idea is that competence, connection, and autonomy are critical for positive youth development. So hence, going back to this question or this challenge, will an emphasis on competence promotion be enough to find risk prevention effects? So there's this idea, again, that are these two perspectives particularly when we're talking about what the funder is asking us to do, are they closely aligned enough for us to be able to kind of make meaning over some of the girls' participation in the program? All right, I'm going to skip over this slide. I put it in. This is sort of the logic model. I know there's way too much text, but I thought, we spent all this time.
We did this though, darn it.
Trying to, sort of show the funders that there's a pathway that we think we're going to be evaluating this process. And anyhow, it was just sort of in there. And it's pretty colorful and, So if we're thinking about some of the challenges, and if I'm going back to the mentoring literature, there's some evidence, as I mentioned earlier, that greater program effects are found when risk is pre-existent. But there becomes this question of how much pre-existing risk is enough to actually find evidence of change, particularly when we're focused on quantitative change. So to give you a sense of who the girls are in the program or where they come from, in terms of ecological context, about a quarter of the youth in the community live in poverty, over half are eligible for free or reduced lunch. And there's some big differences between the youth who are in the local community relative to what's happening in the rest of the state of Virginia. So higher rates of teen pregnancy, higher rates of school dropout and failure on the SOL tests. Specific to the girls in the program, when we ask them about past experiences, almost a third have been suspended from school, just under that have failed a course in school, and about 20% have been in a physical fight. But overall, the sample is really heterogeneous academically, behaviorally, and socially. So I think this is an important issue because in some ways, when thinking about looking for outcomes, particularly focusing on kind of risk prevention or delinquency prevention, one of the things that I wondered about is from a competence promotion perspective, where does a question like this fit in? So if we're thinking about all youth have the capacity to thrive, is this the type of question that a PYD perspective would sort of give any attention to? So, or is this the type of thing that seems to map more onto the prevention side of things? So how much pre-existing risk is enough? Seems to matter in terms of identifying effects in the context of mentoring, but I'm not sure how that gets interpreted when we're talking about competence promotion. And again, going back to Dr. Spencer's points earlier about all youth having some level of vulnerability. One of the other challenges that's specific to mentoring adolescent girls, this came up in David Dubois' review, is that there tend to be weaker program effects when we're looking at girls versus boys. And I don't know if it's coincidental that some of the presentations we've heard about already have focused specifically on outcomes for boys as opposed to girls, but there seems to be some evidence in the literature that you see stronger effects when we're talking about boys as opposed to girls. So Jeanne has speculated on this in terms of girls having potential issues with trust. There's also some evidence that when you talk about relationships, girls with mentors might focus more on kind of emotions, and when we put girls together in groups who are all talking about emotions, that can potentially create some challenges that might undermine looking at sort of positive trajectories or positive effects. All right. So a couple of findings to date, and again, I have divided these up into findings that speak to the competence and promotion side of things, and those that speak a little bit more to prevention. So there have been attenuated declines in academic performance and school bonding from 7th to 8th grade, and this is comparing program versus control. So we're not seeing that girls in the program are, having these great boosts in terms of school bonding and performance, but they're not dropping off, which tends to be normative when we're talking about middle school development. Girls are reporting greater intervening in bullying with their peers in the program versus control. And then they also report improvement in communicating with others, supporting their friends, and dealing with problems. So the program seems to be having some positive effects when we're talking about competence promotion, which is really where the theoretical model begins in terms of how the curriculum is designed. On the prevention side of things, we do, if we're just looking at girls in the program and we're not looking at the control group, we do see a decrease in unexcused absences, in school suspensions, in school fighting. But importantly, these changes are also happening among the girls who are in the comparison group or control group, depending on the year of the evaluation. So on the kind of risk reduction side of things, the effects seem to be a little bit weaker. So stronger effects for promotion versus prevention, which raises some important questions. So is this a matter of, the program isn't very effective? Is it a matter of measures adequately capturing change, and are the risk measures sensitive enough? Given the earlier conversations in response to the first panel, whether or not this question is something that we should sort of think about more carefully, or we should think about kind of changing the research paradigm is something that's come up just recently. I was making notes on this as people were giving their thoughts. Whether or not this is something specific to girls in terms of the types of effects that we see is another question that's again connected back to the mentoring literature. Is it because we're starting with this heterogeneous sample and we haven't sort of gone the full prevention route and started with a very targeted population? Or is it related to this question about competence promotion focus in terms of curriculum? Is that enough to affect domains of risk among girls? So thinking about whether some of these questions are still relevant, given what we talked about earlier today in terms of methodological approaches, sort of bringing in emphasis on mixed methods, I think they are still relevant from a funding perspective. So looking at individual outcomes, I don't think we can completely do away with those. So as a researcher, we're sort of dealing with some of these challenges. How do we identify outcomes that funders seem to be most interested in when we're trying to balance this sort of emphasis on promotion with an emphasis on prevention? So just to summarize, I think now that, again, there's this issue of funders and policymakers' interest in risk prevention, perhaps is too narrow, but I don't know how soon that will potentially change. I think it's important that we recognize mentoring as a developmental intervention that can sort of work on both sides of the coin. So thinking about it as an opportunity to enhance promotive outcomes for youth, but also thinking about it as an opportunity to prevent youth from sort of engaging in negative outcomes. And there's still some challenges that we've sort of run into. Challenges involved in isolating program effects in the context of a heterogeneous sample. Of course, there's still lots of work to be done in this very sort of narrow example that I'm presenting today. We're now looking to, in addition to some of the current data collection, we're thinking about long-term outcomes. So perhaps one of the reasons we're not seeing strong effects in terms of delinquency prevention is because we haven't looked at the girls over a number of years. So that is the direction that we plan to go. And again, at this point, we're sort of seeking funding. Speaking of which, I do want to give some credit to our current funders, as well as all of the researchers that I collaborate with on the project. Like I said, Nancy Deutsch, and there's actually a couple of other people around the table behind me who are involved in the quantitative and qualitative data collection as well. So I'm going to stop there.
I think we had 3 terrific presentations that really highlight the strength of prevention science approach, particularly in terms of going from context to conceptual and systems of influence to looking at very specific processes and using all of that to actually design a program and then evaluate it. So I think that was just terrific. And some of the questions that have come up that I think people will want to discuss are the universal versus targeted versus embedded. You would be embedded, I think. What we're going to do about prevention and or promotion. I heard a call for prevention and promotion, but how's that going to further the way we think about some of these issues? Much more on the setting. Where are we putting our programs? Because we had examples of three different settings. Yes, 3 different settings. And also the interaction of settings like the schools and the family. And then what do people think about the different conceptual models that were presented? So lots of things from this really great session. And I'd open it up to questions. And Stephen is the first. You're so good.
And you followed it.
I'm so proud of you.
I never heard that.
It's really a great way to do things.
I'm intrigued in the context of this issue of is there a difference between prevention and promotion? That the intervention Nick reported on was school improvement, which I've been interested in all my career and never thought about as preventing problem behavior. It's to promote learning and eventual success in the world, assuming, of course, that people who learn are going to get in less trouble, but just conceiving of mastery learning and classroom behavior as means of preventing problem behavior was new to, not the way I would have thought of those things. I mean, I've read about mastery learning decades ago, And it seems to me to speak then to the question about where mentoring fits in. It seems to say, why do you have to make that choice? I mean, why do you have to say, oh, well, mentoring is this or mentoring is that? One of the things that is striking to me about mentoring that comes out in the meta-analysis is the range of effects, of positive effects it has, which is a strength when you're thinking about a program. It's a challenge when you're thinking about evaluating a program. So you want to have a nice, neat, clear outcomes that you can choose a few instruments and measure it and show change, preferably for everybody. And it isn't like that any more than the educational improvement was. And your way of getting inside that and comparing subgroups was intriguing and challenging for some of us to follow, but promising. I think. Not because of you, just because it's complex.
I'll have to do a bit better job next time.
Comments or response to Steve?
Well, I'll say, and I'll go back, and I guess I'm just voicing Shep here. From a developmental standpoint, it shouldn't be surprising that early adaptation sets the stage for later adaptation. Although, obviously, there can be intervening forces in a dynamic developmental process. So, it shouldn't be surprising, at least to psychologists. But folks outside of the field, it is. Steve, I should say Steve Hyman, I'm really getting dated here. Tom Insel doesn't understand that concept, the director of NIMH. So it's something that we, as a field, need to do, or at least the prevention scientists need to do a better job of. But the one thing that strikes me, and Shep has always talked about, this whole incredible, I guess, array of disciplines at University of Chicago, and this whole notion about this life course social fields perspective that he's elaborated many, many times, and I've taken a shot at as well. Seeing schools from the sociological perspective as this, as important as the family in terms of socializing. Think about this. Kids spend Baltimore City, they're typically in elementary school, they start around 8:20, but they're there before that, and then they don't leave to 2:30, 3:30, and then they're after school programs. So teachers represent this incredible opportunity for us to mold and shape, and they can certainly tell us, because they've given us a lot of feedback on some of the things that don't work as well, along with families. And this whole family school partnership thing that I go around and people are really upset when I present these results about, well, your family school partnership intervention doesn't seem to work, you're really going to screw up the field. And one of the things about a public health perspective and an epidemiologic perspective is this thing that is in my head is a denominator. So for our results, it's the entire cohort of first graders who entered. It's not just simply the parents who elected to come. And a lot of the research that's out there, and this is my problem with targeted interventions, and I'm certainly a proponent of targeted interventions as embedded in universals, is that they're all being evaluated based on who comes. And, you typically get, depending on what community you're in, you might get 20%, you might get 30%. So all of a sudden these targeted interventions are so wonderful, and I'm sure they are, but when, in comparison, when you get the whole denominator, what you get is more modest effects, and that's why the argument for, okay, we got to do multiple contexts, but we have to also wed them together, parents and teachers and schools, at least if we're going to focus on the early end of things.
May I just take one observation? Part of my perspective on really everything we've been hearing this morning is conditioned by the initiation of my career in education shortly after the release of the Coleman Report. And for at least 20 years thereafter, the big challenge in education was to show that anything worked. I mean, this is so having things like mentoring, effective prevention programs where you can say, yes, that's refreshing, that's good, that's progress.
I think one other thing I should say is that, and I'm blocking out her name because it's just such a traumatic event for me. Judy Garber published a paper in Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology where they compared the effect sizes of universal interventions with targeted interventions and concluded, oh, you get bigger effect sizes, therefore you shouldn't do universal interventions. And I had this discussion via email with her about denominator issues, and when you have a population-based effect, even if it's, say, 5% reduction in antisocial behavior or incarceration, that's 5% across the population. And so that's, even though these interventions have small effects that are really, in terms of our traditional measures of effect sizes, they're really very large.
Yeah. Greg Duncan has a good article on that, I think is it Child Development Perspectives? A recent one, which is nice, because you're exactly right. Jonathan.
So this building on that point, which is issues of tipping point or power laws or whatever theory you go from. So because Brooke, you mentioned collective issues of building collective efficacy, and so sort of to reflect back, and would love your perspectives on this. If you want to transform our community, how do you go about doing that, and then how do you appropriately evaluate that? And so, is there a way? So you could go universal interventions and get a modest effect. Now that's not necessarily transformational. It could be. If you walk into Detroit and you have a 5-point bump, fantastic, but that doesn't transform. Detroit's still probably not doing so well, mostly. And so is there, how do you sort of build that capacity where you finally do tip and you walk into a community and say, this is different. This feels different. The young people overall are all doing better and maybe toward thriving. So.
I did some of our earliest work with Jody Roth. We had funding from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they wanted to start a community-based intervention. So they had us doing stuff, and I've been doing Chicago, so they thought that would work. And I said to them, what I'd really like to do, I wasn't going to do it, but in my dream of what you would do is that you would try to scale up some interventions in communities, and you'd actually randomly assign to figure out where the tipping point was. And this was for youth development programs. Do you have to reach 50% of the kids in a community? I'm going to define community loosely the way we did in Chicago in terms of neighborhood clusters, because that's a whole nother issue. And they just looked at me and said, we can't do that. I said, but if you could, it would really be useful, because how many kids in a community, especially in poor communities, are getting an intervention? So that was kind of my dream intervention that I wanted them to do, of course, and they just looked at me like, gosh. Now, they didn't disagree that it was important, but they were kind of scratching their heads about how would you do it, how would you actually do a scale up where you're reaching that many kids? The only intervention we have that does is school. I mean, that is our but it was, they wanted community programs. They didn't want to do school, and we kept saying, well, I want to see what happens if you really could reach 50% of the kids. I'll bet you could tip a community. But I don't think you could if it were 10%. And of course, I'm making this up because we have no data. But it would really be interesting if somebody could do some sort of analysis where you could reach, and maybe that can only be done through schools. Maybe that's the answer, because they're there. Patrick had a comment.
Oh, I was going to say.
Sorry.
That's okay. Oh, I don't have my card. An untapped resource, particularly for southern communities, would be the church.
The church,
So
another example.
it's a great mechanism of reaching lots of kids. Yeah, and families.
Okay, just before you I don't want to go on with that point. In Boston,
Very good.
there was an attempt. You mentioned the church, and all of a sudden, this the wind blows in. But in Boston, there was an initiative. It was a few years ago now, where they identified in one community, Grove Hall, which high risk on all factors, and they identified a very small number of youth, really families, and families kind of broadly defined, who were perpetrating most of the crimes in that community. And the idea was, if we can intervene with that small group, what could that do to transform that community? Now, from an intervention perspective, they never figured out exactly how to do it. And so, but to this point, it's like if you could actually intervene in an appropriate way, what could you do?
Patrick.
Two things. One is this issue of promotion versus prevention. And there's actually a backstory as to why we focused our review on prevention. It's not critical. What's critical, I think, is, and your Safe Children and our Safe Children, we both have programs called SAFE,
Yeah.
are focused on promotion
Yes.
of protection and
Yes.
capability rather than about
Risk.
reducing risk factors
That's
within
right.
the family.
That's
So
right.
I think we can, at this point, say that this really is about the outcomes you're looking at, and then something about how you include people in this, rather than what's the mechanism or processes of the interventions. I don't think it's simply settled, but I think we can get fairly close on that. The other thing I was going to talk about is we have this study called Great Schools and Families, and we randomly assigned schools to intervention, and we had one intervention that was focused on the general population, universal, and one was focused on the high risk. And what we found were, and this is important, is the kids who were put into high risk were picked not just because they were more aggressive, but because they were also socially influential. So we were trying to think about tipping point a little differently, which is how do you affect the social processes of student influence, particularly the bad actor that your parents don't want hanging around with you kind of person, but who you seem to follow, that kind of person. So, and what the effects were that we haven't been able to do the mediation analysis to test this specifically, but the effects is that in the schools where we worked with those kids and with their families, and their aggression reduced, in those schools, the general population, a whole nother sample, kids weren't even included in the intervention, they report lower aggression. So there was something about this idea that I think is that maybe the tipping point doesn't have to be like everybody. It could be thinking more about how are these social processes going on and risk being spread. So how, in this case, the families who are committing most, but also in our case, who are the kids that seem to be influencing other kids, but also are perpetrating, making, presumably are modeling aggression. So there's maybe opportunities there to think about.
Okay. I've got Rico, I did have Nancy, but she quickly put hers down. I had Ed. Now see, your Aunt Valerie was next, then Dale. See, I really do pay attention.
Okay.
And Rico, you walked out just when you put your little tent up, and I went, he put his tent up and he walked. He can't do that.
I had to get my pen. I left it in the other
You
room.
just can't put your tent up and walk out.
Yeah,
It's not-
I know. I knew I was listening, and I knew I'd run back if Pat stopped talking. But, I knew I had a chance. So just a couple of comments. One is Jeffrey Rose in 1981 wrote The Prevention Paradox. It's this idea that, if you just, and he was talking about, cardiovascular disease and cholesterol, and he's saying if you only pick the people with high cholesterol, you're going to prevent less deaths than if you looked in the lower risk part of the population, where actually there's more death from heart disease than there was in the high end, because the high end is, those with 350, whatever the score is, high score, is going to be a smaller portion of the whole population. Even though the other places it's, less of an incidence problem, there's so much greater population that you're going to have more cases. So that's just backing up Nick's idea of universal prevention is important. The other thing that I think about in trying to respond to John is, can we find those bad actors and, and change, if we could just change them, the whole community would be better. Well, those bad actors got that way because, not just because of individual characteristics, and I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist, and it happens from the communities putting their kids at risk and the family problems and the other kinds of things. If you just did MST for every, kid who is having trouble, you still are having the whole, this, so you replace the people at the top, and help them, but it's not going to stop the funnel towards risk behavior or anything else. You knock one gang out, another gang comes in. So you can't just kill the problem by working only at the targeted end. It's important it does make neighborhoods safer, but you also have to attack the youth development principles, the risk principles that are driving the behavior in the first place. And if you don't change all those conditions, you're just going to have replacement sample that's coming in to be bad actors. So I just think that you have to do that. And if you want to have a number, Dick Spoth has kind of done one study where he's looked at parenting, and he's got about 40% of the parents, 30 to 40%, and he sees population-wide effects. That's something you can cite. And our trial of communities that care got about 50% of the kids involved and had a community population-wide effect as well. So we're beginning to get answers on these things, and I have other comments for Joanna, but we'll talk at lunch. I also wanted to make a specific comment, but this one was more general and really, really important that we're making these efforts at trying to think about population-wide and tiered interventions, which is what I liked about Nick's saying. It is, but just doing the tier alone or just doing the high end alone is going to give us a false sense of we're making a big difference when we're not. Why prevention is so important is we're trying to change the way kids are raised, and why promotion of youth development is so important. And that's why it has wide-ranging effects, because those predictors, whether they're risk protective, promotive factors, youth development characteristics, affect all the darn problems and all the positive outcomes. So of course we should expect multi-outcomes from this.
I should add something. It's just my experience and what we've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years, piloting the targeted and trying to create this blend so that it's seamless, so that we don't have like family checkup or family checkup is supposed to be universal, but say coping power or incredible years.
Yeah.
And so that there's a common language spoken. So that needs a lot of work, because the folks who develop the interventions, they don't like us messing around with them. But I think for them to work, we need that blend. And just as a testimony to this, there's a lot of people who are doing work on hot cognitions and trying to get kids in a vacuum to somehow, another kid comes up to them, pushes them, that they're not going to react with aggression. That's just not going to work. That's where you have to have the universal in place, and you have to have adults involved. And you can certainly have mentoring around that kind of, but to expect that a kid in Baltimore City is going to allow another kid to push him in front of other kids, oh, come on, please. And that's where I get a little, the emotion regulation stuff I'm all for, but please, there is a larger social context that, and you have to survive. Now, one thing I also have to throw out there, and it was very disconcerting for us to find this, but I think it came out in a special issue that you might have been involved in, Dante had in development psychopathology, where we took those growth mixture trajectories and we took, and I want to emphasize this, I forgot, that most of the kids in Baltimore City, even though it's one of the most violent cities in the country, most of those kids are not aggressive or disruptive. Okay, so it's a big myth that black kids in urban settings, so most of those kids are not. However, the kids who are in that low trajectory from first grade through 7th grade, particularly the males, still have an increased rate of incarceration or being picked up, for arrest. And what we did was, and I'm sure methodologically people would jump all over us, because those growth mixture trajectories are latent. They're not really observed. So you have multiple, right, so, okay. But anyway, but what we found was, and this is, a lot of post hoc analyses, that those males who were in that low aggression trajectory for 7 years, as rated by teachers, who were, either involved in the juvenile justice or the adult incarceration system, tended to come from, first of all, they were black, and then they tended to come from communities that were high crime, leading us to believe, and not this whole trademark, issue has brought this to, the forefront for me, is that you live in a community where there's a lot of policing. Okay, so this is the problem. When you have a lot of policing, you have a lot of minor crimes that lead to incarceration, and then it does exactly what, deviant peer stuff that Tom DeShawn and others have been doing for quite some time. Right. You're all of a sudden you're into the, so you have to be very careful, because Baltimore has this big thing about trying to target the bad actors. But essentially you have to be very, very careful about that because it could have iatrogenic effects. But anyway.
I've got Ed and then Valerie.
So I want to amplify on some of the things that were said, and Phil was just saying. I think, and Judy Garber doesn't understand, people don't understand the public health model. When you're talking about prevention or promotion, you're talking about universal public health kind of model. In the Rose chapter, I use it in all my prevention. It's a chapter, sort of, I don't know, David Hoffman once gave it to me. 1990 or something like that. And that's sort of a great chapter. And then the prevention promotion dilemma is one where you might be trying to achieve both, but there's huge conceptual differences when you're talking about prevention because you're preventing negative kind of things. So the wisdom of the Hopkins program is it was a positive kind of approach. And it was talking about sort of the mechanisms and the structure of classroom organization to have a positive, and it did lead to huge gains in prevention. When you take a prevention focus, then it's hard not to be labeling individuals, blaming the victim, and causing iatrogenic effects. So it's huge conceptually. It's quite foreign, not to Valerie, but to NIMH in the way the current structure is going, because they're going in a very individual biological direction. But you remain with the dilemma of how you get things funded, but it has huge conceptual implications. And I also think I'm somebody, and John Reed was one of my best friends, but you don't really have to do the preventive or the promotive and the selected and indicated. What we're trying to do is reduce, even when you think in prevention, you're trying to reduce the number of things, but you don't have to do all of it. Maybe other people should be doing the targeted stuff. Maybe they shouldn't be all lumped together because you can't do everything, and then you get sucked in to the Judy Garber argument.
Valerie?
Well, I think Ed said a little bit of what I was going to say. And I guess I'll point out that the points that Joanne raised about funding, and is particularly for junior scholars, and the point that you were making about Judy Garber, I think is right at the heart of the problem. At least at NIH, it's not the institute, it's the peer review process that's the first hurdle. So these are your peers, your colleagues.
These are your peers. We're very good at being critical, aren't we?
Well, and I guess the point is that to the extent that you have these kind of divergent perspectives about a field, and these are the people who will be around tables like this reviewing your applications, you will get these kind of gaps in funding, not only good research and innovative research that might advance a field forward, but then you have junior scholars who have a difficult time getting at the table of wealth, as it were, because you have people who are tasked to look at innovation but want to see convention, and hold you accountable for not being innovative because you didn't use a measure that so-and-so used 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, that was not innovative.
That's right. And we sit at the table, and we're guests to these review meetings, and I sit there and do all kinds of facial grimacing.
Like Mark.
And just kind of dropping my pencil really loud, and kinds of things like, oh my God, I can't believe they didn't see this. But and then of course at the risk of getting thrown out of the meeting. But I think that's a point, and perhaps what we need to do here is to think about how do we inform the broader community about the iatrogenic effects, about these kind of perspectives, like universal, versus targeted, and where do we begin to change the discussion so that more and more people who are forward thinking and who are flexible enough in their thinking will allow these kinds of studies to get through that first hurdle, because oftentimes I feel so badly because I encourage a lot of people with these dynamic ideas to throw their hat in the ring. Go ahead, give it a try. I think it's great. If they gave me a checkbook, I'd pay you the first, for the first phase, but they won't give me any because they know I'd be broke after the first week. But those are the kinds of challenges that we have. We encourage innovation. We spend a lot of time working to develop these ideas, and then by the time they get through that first hurdle, for some of them you have to really pare down your ideas so significantly just to squeak through that what you wind up with actually getting funded is often not your initial ideas. So we, having that conversation and figuring out how to have more forums where people understand the importance of advancing the science, so you can get more of the kind of like-minded, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, people around the table. The second thing I wanted to point out, is that this has not been really studied very systematically, but Jim Comer has been doing this kind of work for eons, and his unit analysis, of course, is the schools, but his theory of change is parents, and it started out actually with parent involvement. To the extent that you can teach parents about children's development, then they can not only educate, do the proactive parenting. I've forgotten, Velma, the phrase that you used. No nonsense and proactive, but informed parenting at home and in their communities. But they also can advocate for their kids in those schools where they are more likely to be suspended for minor infractions. Over the years, what Comer has done was to move to a more systemic intervention, so that his program was now the parent nested in the schools, nested in the district, nested in the state. And they taking the ideas for his intervention model from that individual kind of parent involvement model to now looking at how do we, knowing that urban school systems turn over every 2 or 3 years, how do we educate and train the charismatic leader in the school so that when inevitably the school turns over, that you still have people who understand child development, all these kinds of things that we want to promote, so that we may skip a little bit of a beat, but we won't miss the whole dance. And then the same thing with the school board and the state educators. And so he's been, over the course of the years, trying to work that through, but his program hasn't been systematically evaluated. Tom Cook did an evaluation in Prince George's County, and somebody else I'm blanking on did an evaluation in some of the schools in the southern states. But those ideas, to get young scholars like you to take the principles of that idea and to collaborate with programs that have the promise of being more promotive, and applying models that might be more effective, I think would be really, really useful. And those are the kinds of things that I would be, if I had a checkbook, that is, I'd be interested in funding.
I want to comment on the community issues that we were talking about and John's question and stuff. But there are stuff happening in the community efforts around out-of-school time and things to get systems approaches to providing those kinds of opportunities. So it's not just about, my best description of out-of-school time programs is it's a non-system, which you can't, with high variability and high inequitable access, and so you can't study it. So you've got to try to change the system or make a system in some ways to do it. And there are efforts now to start doing that so that you could then see whether or not you can get to tipping points around things like John's talking about. When I worked with Search Institute, we went around and talked to communities about the developmental assets. One of the things that always, and we studied some of those communities over time a little bit, one of the things that always sort of anecdotally I walked away with is the energy was much higher in communities that were struck by the absence of assets than were struck by the presence of problems. And the extent to which motivation of particularly the social leaders in the community, not necessarily the organizational leaders or makes a difference in the way you think about this to get to the point of things. And one last point on the collective stuff, on the community stuff, is as important as it is for us is to get researchers on the same page around outcomes of types we're talking about. the collective impact and stuff, the STRIVE efforts and other kind of efforts, they're trying to get communities to actually define the outcomes in more inclusive ways as opposed to more exclusive school-only ways is a really critical factor to dealing with some of this. Lastly, on Nick's point and Joanna's point about their findings, one way of looking at the findings in a sense similarly is that, Nick, and you were saying this, I think, in part, some of the findings you found for the intervention may have been because you changed the language in the community, and so it wasn't just that parent or that child, but you changed the way the frame could be set, and so you changed a collective view of it. And part of the reason you may not be getting effects on the risk stuff is that you're changing an individual's competence, but they're going back into the same context in which that competence is inadequate, potentially to overcome the problems that are already exist in some ways. And so it's a context individual connection that we've been talking about very nicely.
Margaret's going to speak, and then if Joanna and Velma, because you guys haven't during this, if you have something to end, it would be great.
I'd like to add on to this point of the importance of sort of a systems approach or universality orientation, because prevention promotion might not be, in essence, relevant. Go back to Ed's point, when you're looking at things in this way, because of the heterogeneity of individuals within. So for some individuals, it is promotion, because they have some protective factors that are working for them, even though they're still burdened by some risks. On the other hand, at the same time, you have individuals for whom the universal, if you will, or systems approach will serve as prevention, because they have more risk, and therefore this serves as prevention. I think that way of thinking about it reminds us of the heterogeneity within communities. And we think about communities in need, we often think about them as everyone being, if you will, daunted by heavy needs and there are no strengths. And I go back to my earlier point, that's why for me, talking about vulnerability for everyone, okay, acknowledges that even within, sort of low resource appearing system, there are still some strengths there. Because, they're there and we need to think about them as, therefore, our efforts is promoting them. And I think in general, taking that kind of approach, you go back to Richard's point this morning about, in essence, only that sort of orientation allows us to think about these issues from a social justice perspective. Because people who have resources, the universal, if you will, supports are always there. And that's why the experiences are what I call, for the kids, consonants. There is a consistency, okay, between what a kid needs and the nature of the responsive context. But for other kids, that there is this dissonance. There's a discontinuity between what you need and the resources that are accessible. So I just think that we need to, think about some communities having these supports and resources always. But we're looking at the same outcomes for everyone. And so you're always going to have a gap if you don't have programming that's more systems level, because let's face it, white middle income folks have that every day. And other groups do not, because we don't have a system that demonstrates any sort of fairness or equity. And that's my point, and therefore this prevention, in essence, promotion, tension is not tension at all. It speaks to the heterogeneity within.
Comment. When Margaret was explaining the difference between where people come into programs, some may benefit more from a promotive stance and then prevention, and it reminded me that the majority of our families would fall into the category of promotive, that the program was really a promotional of. But those families that came in our program that were at high risk, and they were high risk because of family problems, economic situations that were more dire, and a lot of other mental health problems, those families we saw greater change in the program's effect on them, which means, and then they began to reduce more of those negative parenting behaviors, which means in the context of this universal promotive program, we had both occurring. The other comment that I want to make is we keep bringing to the forefront this whole notion of context. And I want us to really think about how do we begin to really address this in our work, because sometimes those contextual processes are beyond what families and children can do anything about. And it's for that reason that we begin to focus more on those things that are much more proximal to the child, the family, because our families were nested in communities where they really couldn't activate a lot of change at the community level, including the school, in a much more broad global sense, to create a better environment for their child. And so for us, it was really finding a way to promote and enhance those things that were much more proximal to the child. So I want us to really think about this in the context of children's development, that they're nested in, and we keep saying that, a much larger context. How do we begin to infuse that in our efforts to both prevent and be promotive?
So my final comments, I think, also relate to this issue of heterogeneity, which I think is really important. But I do think it still presents challenges as we think about a positive youth development perspective. And I'll keep going back to the funding issue, which I appreciate people's insights into. So then what do we tell people, whether or not, whether it's a junior scholar or people on the nonprofit side of things who are looking for evidence so that they can get more funding to continue doing the type of work that they're doing. How do we sort of address some of these things in terms of program design as well as methodological evaluation? So really what I look forward to is kind of continued discussion in terms of thinking about some of these issues. Tomorrow when we get into later today, the panel on methods, I think that will be really informative in terms of thinking about how to push some of this work forward in ways that benefit people on the program side as well as people on the research side. So moving from theory to practice, I think it's still kind of an important issue.